Omnibus re-examines one of the great enigmas of the 20th century, the man who became known as Lawrence of Arabia and his place in history, with archive material and following in his footsteps in the desert with filmed reconstructions which were specially shot in Jordan.
Lawrence of Arabia is dead. Lung trouble following a motorcycle accident which rendered him unconscious for days has killed the mystery man of the 20th century. Aircraftman Shaw, to give him his adopted name, has always been a difficult man to photograph ever since his war exploits made him the uncrowned king of Arabia. We make no apology, therefore, for the indifferent quality of this film. It is the only film record in existence of the most remarkable man this age has discovered.
It wasn't the only film of T.E. Lawrence. Throughout his life, he was remorselessly pursued by cameras and by newspaper reporters. The legend began towards the end of the First World War, when an American journalist, Lowell Thomas, was sent to cover the conflict in Arabia. He took a film cameraman with him, and the hero he found for what he would call his adventure film was a 29-year-old scholar and archaeologist serving as an intelligence officer in the British Army. The legend of Lawrence was to haunt him for the rest of his life. It became hateful to him, but even his desperate attempts to escape it turned into headline news. And yet it seems it was a legend that he'd wished for, even helped to create. In his book, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, he confesses,
"There was a craving to be famous, and a horror of being known to like being known. Contempt for my passion for distinction made me refuse every offered honor.
And in a letter to a friend, he wrote,
I am very weary of being stared at and discussed and praised. What can one do to be forgotten? After I'm dead, they'll rattle my bones about in their curiosity."
30 years after his death, the story of Lawrence came to the big screen in a film based in part on his own 7 Pillars of Wisdom. Peter O'Toole's powerful demonic portrayal is the image that still sticks.
Come on, men!
For over a quarter of a century, controversy has raged around the name of T.E. Lawrence. No man of our time has drawn upon himself so much praise and so much criticism.
He was the most extraordinary man I ever knew.
He was a very great man.
He was a poet, a scholar, and a mighty warrior. He was also the most shameless exhibitionist since Barnum and Bailey.
But 7 Pillars is a work of literature, and like David Lean's film, for the Arabs themselves, it reinforced a myth, overstated Lawrence's role in the Arab revolt, even suggested that he alone had been its hero.
ظلت الله وظلت حسين إن شاء الله عام.
50 years after his death, we re-examine the legend of Lawrence with a new perspective, the views of the Arabs themselves. We revisit the places where he made his name, and with unique archive film of the Arab revolt, we seek out the evidence of historians and of friends and colleagues, some of whom speak here for the first time about this complex and extraordinary man.
Some of the evil of my tale may have been inherent in our circumstances. For years we lived anyhow with one another in the naked desert under the indifferent heaven. By day the hot sun fermented us, and we were dizzied by the beating wind. At night we were stained by dew and shamed into pettiness by the innumerable silences of stars. We lived always in the stretch or sag of nerves, either on the crest or in the trough of waves of feeling. Blood was always on our hands. We were licensed to it. We lived for the day and died for it.
Lawrence was two things. First of all, he was a British officer who played an important part in a major political event, the Arab Revolt, which was supported by Britain, and which led to, at least in part, the political configuration of the Arab world as we know it today. And secondly, he was the writer of a major creative literary work.
Lawrence was, I believe, an imperial figure who believed in the importance of will. And I think here his literary background and the fact that he himself was a man of rather questionable background allowed him to see the world as a place of fairly fluid possibilities, so that every situation he was in, Lawrence would try to sort of make the situation conform to his will. I mean, he says this openly in the outset of the Seven Pillars. You know, he wanted to write his will across the stars. He wanted to make an impression on the world, in a sense.
Most of us don't feel we've got to prove ourselves to the point of total exhaustion and probably nervous breakdown. But Lawrence had this curious mechanism. Why he should, it must go back to his boyhood, his childhood. But he needed to demonstrating all the time that he was as tough as the Bedouin were, that he could do as they did, could live as they did. It's a curious thing, but loners are often like that.
Thomas Edward Lawrence was born in 1888 in North Wales. He claimed that he could read and write before the age of 4. He was the second of 5 sons born to unusual parents. His father was an Anglo-Irish landowner called Thomas Chapman, who left his wife and ran away with his children's governess. After several years of travelling, they set up home in Oxford under the assumed name of Lawrence. The mother was herself born illegitimate. She was the dominant personality in the household, bringing up her sons as good Anglicans and enforcing strict discipline and making education a priority. All the Lawrence boys went to the City High School at Oxford. From the start, Ned, as he was known, had been encouraged and expected to excel.
It was a religious upbringing. It had everything that you would expect a Victorian childhood to have. I think that his childhood with his family of 4 brothers was obviously a very happy childhood. His parents weren't married, but the children didn't know that. And they lived together as husband and wife, and not, as people tend to think, as an illegitimate broken home of some kind. He became very interested in the history of the biblical periods. He passed out top in scripture exams and that kind of thing. He became interested in medieval brass rubbing, in medieval architecture, in medieval pottery. It was all historical. It was all outside the present period. But it was a passionate interest.
Well, we were at school together. I think chiefly I remember him in the 4th form. I suppose we were about 14. I was, chipping him, saying, I'm older than you are. I was 1 day older. He said, but I was born on Napoleon's birthday. That's when I first remember him, 14. And it was interesting watching him grow up. There was a sort of dual personality. There was the boy, and there was also, I think he called it a mask. That's rather crude, but it is the boy in the mouth. We all liked him, but he began to be quite different. But chiefly I remember this sort of hardening process. He was preparing for something big to come. He turned up one morning, mad as a hatter. His eyes were shooting out of his head, and got a revolver in his hand and walked in my rooms. And he said, I'd been trying to see how long I could go without food or without sleep for 45 hours or something. I thought, well, let's get rid of this revolver, and we fired a shot down the turret. It was fortunately a blank cartridge, but I was glad to get it out of my way. I was quite frightened of him. That's the kind of thing he did, you see.
Well, I was 12 years younger, you know, but it didn't make as much difference as you might think, because we not only had the same inheritance, we had the same environment, the same education. And he carefully implanted in me his own interests, particularly interest in the ancient world, Assyrian, Greek, Roman, and in the medieval world.
In 1909, while he was reading history at Jesus College, Oxford, Lawrence visited the Middle East for the first time. He went on a 3-month walking tour of Syria and Palestine, covering 1,100 miles and visiting the ruined castles of the Crusaders.
I've had a most delightful tour, on foot and alone all the time, so that I've perhaps, living as an Arab with the Arabs, got a better insight into the daily life of the people than those who travel with caravan and dragoman. Some 37 out of the 50-odd castles were on my proposed route, and I have seen all but one of them. Many are quite unpublished, so of course I've had to make many plans, drawings and photographs.
From his childhood, he'd been obsessed with military history, and he'd chosen to write his Oxford thesis on the influence of the Crusades on European military architecture. For its time, Lawrence's thesis was recognized as a piece of pioneering research. It won him a first-class honours degree in modern history. At Jesus College, he'd put on military uniform for the first time when he joined the Officers' Training Corps. There he could indulge his fascination with military tactics and with firearms. He practiced with his pistol until he was a crack shot using either hand. Lawrence left Oxford in 1910. 4 years after this picture was taken, 2 out of the 5 Lawrence brothers would perish on the battlefields of Europe. T.E.'s destiny lay in a different direction. Immediately after Oxford, he'd been invited to join a British Museum team on an excavation. The site was a 4,000-year-old Hittite city at Carchemish on the river Euphrates, and Lawrence's role was to record the finds, manage the workforce, and take the official photographs. But Carchemish was in Syria, and Syria was an occupied country. For 400 years, most of the Middle East had suffered under the oppressive rule of the Ottoman Empire. And now the Turks and their German allies were building a Berlin to Baghdad railway, close to the site where the British team was excavating. Years later, the stories began to emerge that Lawrence and his boss, the eminent archaeologist D.G. Hogarth, were actually engaged on a spying mission.
Yes, that of course is nonsense. They also suggested that he'd have been trained as a spy by Hogarth, and that all Hogarth's excavations were in fact concealed spying efforts. There was something to spy upon, if you like, at Carchemish, and that was the building of a railway bridge, which took years and years, and was visible to everybody, and couldn't possibly be kept hidden. It was simply a journalistic invention.
I've got to like this place very much, and the people here and the whole manner of living pleases me. We have 200 men to play with, anyhow we like, so long as the excavations go on, and they're splendid fellows, many of them. I had 2 of them headmen in England with me this summer, and it's great fun with them.
One of the men who'd been to Oxford with Lawrence was Selim Ahmed, nicknamed Dahum, the Dark One. His intelligence and aptitude for learning singled him out, and he became Lawrence's protégé and constant companion. Lawrence taught him photography. This is Dahum's portrait of Lawrence, wearing Dahum's clothes. The relationship lasted nearly 4 years. It was one of the closest Lawrence ever had. But Dahum died of typhus at Carchemish in 1918, and it is possibly to him, Selim Ahmed, that Lawrence was to dedicate 7 Pillars of Wisdom.
I loved you, so I drew these tides of men into my hands and wrote my will across the sky in stars to earn you freedom, the seven-pillared worthy house, that your eyes might be shining for me when we came. Death seemed my servant on the road, till we were near and saw you waiting, when you smiled, and in sorrowful envy he outran me and took you apart into his quietness.
In the spring of 1914, the archaeologists from Carchemish did begin to work with military intelligence. They were called in as a civilian disguise for a British military map-making expedition. Now Lawrence began to get to know intimately the terrain in which he would later be fighting side by side with the Arabs. His return to Carchemish took him up the Hijaz Railway. Muslim pilgrims used the line to travel to Mecca, but so did the Turks, to reinforce their garrisons in the south. The railway would soon become a natural target for Arab attacks, and Lawrence himself would be blowing up the very tracks on which he was now traveling. Within the year, Turkey would side with the German and Austro-Hungarian empires against Britain and France. With his specialist knowledge of the Middle East, Lawrence was sent as an intelligence officer to British headquarters in Cairo. Secret negotiations between the Allies and the Arab leaders had been underway for some time. In Seven Pillars, Lawrence explains the motive.
Some Englishmen, of whom Kitchener was chief, believed that a rebellion of Arabs against Turks would enable England, while fighting Germany, simultaneously to defeat her ally Turkey.
The Arab Revolt was a national movement, and it was a very important national movement. As far as the Arabs were concerned, it meant renaissance, it meant an awakening of a great nation. It was the expression of the national and self-pride of a whole people. So, there were arrangements with the tribes. The Sharif has been Emir of Mecca for 8 years. During those 8 years, he has established himself as a leader. And by this establishment of leadership, he has got all the tribes of the Hijaz around him. It was Saturday, the 9th of Sha'ban, the 10th of June 1916, when the revolt started. In the very early of the morning of that Saturday, Sharif Hussein took a rifle and made a shot. And that shot was the sign for his men to attack the strongholds of the Ottoman forces. And afterwards, of course, there was fighting in Medina, there was fighting in Jeddah, fighting all around the Hijaz.
Lawrence had been waiting for just such a moment. From his earliest days in the Middle East, he'd conceived a vision of a united Arabia, freed from the Ottoman rule, benevolently steered towards independence by Britain. He was fueled by a genuine passion for the rights of the Arab people, but there was personal ambition too, a vision of heroism and romance.
All men dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of their minds wake in the day to find that it was vanity. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act their dream with open eyes to make it possible. This I did. I meant to make a new nation, to restore a lost influence, to give 20 millions of Semites the foundations on which to build an inspired dream palace of their national thoughts.
But the dream palace was to be built on less than firm foundations. The British and the French began to pour weapons and equipment into the rebellion, and the Arabs were led to believe that their cooperation with the Allies would ensure their freedom when the conflict was over, that when they'd reached their goal, the holy city of Damascus, they would once again rule it. But far away in Europe, the French and British governments were reaching a secret agreement to divide up the Middle East between them once the war was over. Lawrence had already created for himself a major role. He was searching for an Arab leader who would, in his own words, carry the revolt to the goal I had conceived for it. He began to visit and indeed to assess the 4 sons of Sharif Hussein. He met the Emir Abdullah, the second son of the Sharif, who'd already captured one of the vital Turkish strongholds at Taif.
He was open and charming. He stood not on ceremony, but argued shrewdly. I became more and more sure that Abdullah was too balanced, too cool to be the armed prophet. His value would come, perhaps, in the peace after success.
A long and arduous camel ride, the first of many for which he became famous, took Lawrence 2 days across the desert to Wadi Safra to visit the 3rd son of Sharif Hussein.
I felt at first glance that this was the man I'd come to Arabia to seek, the leader who would bring the Arab revolt to full glory. Faisal looked very tall and pillar-like. His black beard and colourless face were like a mask against the strange, still watchfulness of his body. "And do you like our place here in Wadi Safra?" "Well, but it is far from Damascus." The word had fallen like a sword in their midst. Faisal at length lifted his eyes, smiling at me, and said, "Praise be to God, there are Turks nearer us than that."
Now, Prince Faisal was a highly sophisticated, urbanized Arab gentleman with strong links to the Ottoman Empire in pre-war days. He certainly wasn't a local Bedouin chief just charging around on a camel. He was a very skillful political operator, and he also had a military flair. The fact that they were dressed up in robes and riding camels for military reasons and so on, I think has, in British romantic eyes, given a totally false impression of this.
In many cases, Faisal was short of money. So he invited Lawrence and said to him, "What can you do?" So Lawrence used to go to Egypt. And in many cases, he helped to solve the problems. So Faisal saw and not used Lawrence, Faisal saw the advantage of cooperating with Lawrence, of trying to get the help of Lawrence.
I think the Sharif has probably in all about 15,000 to 20,000 men mobilized. About 10% are camel corps and the rest infantry, some of whom are desert tribes and some hill tribes. The hillmen struck me as good material for guerrilla warfare. They're hard and fit, very active, independent, cheerful snipers. They'll serve only under their tribal sheikhs and only in their home district or near it. The personnel of the army thus changes incessantly. This is inevitable in tribal warfare. Faisal asked me if I would wear Arab clothes. The tribesmen would then understand how to take me. They behaved to me as though I were really one of the leaders. I agreed at once, very gladly. And the Arab things were cleaner and more decent in the desert.
Lawrence's job with Faisal's army was liaison officer. He realized early on, and persuaded the British commanders too, that the strength of the Arab fighting men lay not in formal military tactics, but in the centuries-old tradition of guerrilla warfare.
Suppose we were, as we might be, an influence, an idea, a thing intangible, invulnerable, without front or back, drifting about like a gas. Armies were like plants, immobile, firm-rooted, nourished through long stems to the head. We might be a vapor, blowing where we listed. Most wars were wars of contact. Ours should be a war of detachment. We were to contain the enemy by the silent threat of a vast, unknown desert.
In Lawrence's 7 Pillars, his own account of the Arab revolt, the desert stage on which it's played out becomes a kind of medieval battleground, and the leading characters are certainly the stuff of legend.
Suleiman, the guest master, hurried in and whispered to Faisal, who turned to me with shining eyes and said, "Auda is here." At that moment, the tent flap was drawn back. there entered a tall, strong figure with a haggard face, passionate and tragic. We'd heard much of Auda. He had married 28 times and been wounded 13 times. He himself had slain 75 men, Arabs, with his own hand in battle. Of the number of dead Turks, he could give no account. They didn't enter the register. He saw life as a saga. All the events in it were significant. All personages in contact with him, heroic.
Auda's son, Muhammad, is also described in Seven Pillars as an 11-year-old boy fighting at his father's side. Nearly 70 years later, chief of the Hawitat in his turn, he remembers his father's meeting with Lawrence.
حنا نفتح العقبة ومن العقبة نبدأ الحرب. أخذوا رأيهم واتفقوا على الرأي هذا وجاء لورنس جاب لورنس وقال هذا رفيقك. ومشى معنا لورنس.
Lawrence was very popular with the Bedouins because he imitated their own ways. He lived with them as one of them. And he ate the food they ate. He rode the camels as they rode, distances as much as they did. So they liked him, they admired him, they thought that he was their friend.
But even as he rode north with the gathering tribes, Lawrence was becoming more and more distressed by the growing trust the Arab leaders had placed in his word. For by now, he had discovered the Allies' plan to divide the Middle East.
Not being a perfect fool, I could see that if we won the war, the promises to the Arabs were dead paper. Had I been an honorable advisor, I would have sent my men home and not let them risk their lives for such stuff. Yet the Arab inspiration was our main tool in winning the Eastern War. So I assured them that England kept her word in letter and spirit. In this comfort, they performed their fine things. But of course, instead of being proud of what we did together, I was continually and bitterly ashamed.
You're dealing with somebody who came from a very moral background, a very Christian upbringing, who had a very high set of standards, who had taught at Sunday school, who had a very strong sense of his personal integrity. And you put him into a position which is absolutely appalling from the moral point of view.
In a message to Cairo, which he drafted and then withdrew, he wrote,
I've decided to go off alone to Damascus, hoping to get killed on the way. For all sakes, try to clear this show up before it goes further. We're calling them to fight for us on a lie, and I can't stand it.
But he did go on.
There was no escape for me. I must take up again my mantle of fraud in the East. With my certain contempt for half measures, I took it up quickly and wrapped myself in it completely.
The next objective was the vital port of Aqaba at the northern end of the Red Sea. The Turkish fortress there had been under bombardment from British and French warships, but the bulk of the Turkish forces were in the hills behind the town. Lawrence, with Auda and 2 other Arab leaders, rode in a great loop through the desert, heading for the heights above Aqaba. They gathered a force of 500 men as they went, and on the journey Lawrence himself took these photographs. It was a long and arduous ride through a waterless desert. It took 2 months to reach their objective. Lawrence took pride always in describing how he kept up with his Arab companions, but it is known that during these journeys he suffered from recurrent bouts of malaria and dysentery and from infected sores on his body. The attack on Aqaba turned out to be a complete success. The Arabs rode into the town, meeting little resistance.
And Lawrence, in fact, I'm quite sure, consciously set out to emulate the Bedouin and, if possible, to beat them in terms of endurance. Of course, he was on a hiding to nothing where that was concerned. Couldn't possibly. But I think it fitted in with his rather sort of masochistic character. I think he liked flagellating himself, if that's the word. And it was part of his personality, part of his character. Odd, but nevertheless true.
While the Arabs were celebrating their victory at Aqaba, Lawrence took news of it to the Allied headquarters in Cairo, who sent Faisal's troops £16,000 in gold for their efforts and expenses in capturing the port. In 7 Pillars of Wisdom, Lawrence is quite clear about his own role in the victory.
Aqaba had been taken on my plan by my effort. For months, Aqaba had been the horizon of our minds, the goal. We had had no thought, we had refused thought of anything beside.
I think that he assumed too much in saying that Aqaba was captured by his plans and by his own designs. The expedition went, to my mind, its ordinary course of a tribal raid. And this tribal raid reached Aqaba. I will not deny Lawrence's share, but I will not give him, really, to be fair to others, I will not give him all the credit.
General Allenby, the British commander-in-chief, had been much impressed by Lawrence and was persuaded by him to see the real potential of the Arab revolt as a vital part of the Allies' strategic plan. Allenby sent more supplies, munitions, and the always essential gold to Aqaba. He backed the revolt with armored cars and with planes. Now the Hijaz Railway became the main target of the Arab attacks. A large Turkish garrison was cut off far to the south in Medina. It could only be served by the vulnerable desert railway. Lawrence and the Arabs were able to dynamite the line almost anywhere along the 600-mile stretch to Medina.
I ran down to the ruins to see what the mine had done. Wagons were derailed and smashed. Some had frames irreparably buckled. The engine was a blanched pile of smoking iron. Its driving wheels had been blown upward, taking away the side of the firebox. Cab and tender were twisted into strips among the piled stones of the bridge. It would never run again.
وضربوا الخط من حاج حتى تيجي مع انشلوا واخذوا 7 ترينات ورنس شجاع ذيب ما يخاف نعم.
The Turks were already fully occupied in Palestine, trying to hold off an Allied advance. Supplying beleaguered Medina was an extra dilemma, and Lawrence was content to leave them with it.
We must not take Medina. The Turk was harmless there. In prison in Egypt, he would cost us food and guards. We wanted him to stay at Medina and every other distant place in the largest numbers. Our ideal was to keep his railway just working, but only just, with the maximum of loss and discomfort. He was welcome to the Hejaz Railway and the Transjordan Railway and the Palestine and Syrian railways for the duration of the war, so long as he gave us the other 999 thousandths of the Arab world.
The soldier who recorded these careful accounts of military tactics was still a scholar, one who'd always dreamed of writing an epic work. Now, in the revolt, Lawrence was surrounded by finer subject matter than he could have dreamed of. The story I have to tell, he said later to a friend, is one of the most splendid ever given a man for writing. By September 1917, he'd begun making notes for the book on army message pads. They were descriptive rather than military, since there was always a risk they might fall into enemy hands. Later, he would construct from these fragments the poetic descriptions that he scatters throughout 7 Pillars, personal meditations on the people he met and the places he passed by on the adventure of his life.
We were riding for Rum, a place which stirred my thought, as even the unsentimental Howitt had told me it was lovely. Day was still young as we rode between two great pikes of sandstone to the foot of a long, soft slope. We looked up on the left to a long wall of rock, sheering in like a 1,000-foot wave towards the middle of the valley, whose other arc, to the right, was an opposing line of steep, red, broken hills. The crags were capped in nests of domes. They gave the finishing semblance of Byzantine architecture to this irresistible place. The Arab armies would have been lost in the length and breadth of it, and within the walls a squadron of aeroplanes could have wheeled in formation. Our little caravan grew self-conscious and fell dead quiet, afraid and ashamed to flaunt its smallness in the presence of the stupendous hills. Landscapes in childhood's dream were so vast and silent.
Well, it's a history of the Arab Revolt, but I think it's meant to be more of a literary work than a historical work. And I think when Lawrence says that he wanted to write an epic in the tradition of Homer and Virgil and Milton, I think we ought to take him seriously. So I think it's that kind of a work, a literary, poetic, above all, autobiographical work. Its style is heavily influenced by people like Doty and Mallory. And there's a great preciosity to it, a great sophistication to its sentence structure and paragraph structure, as well as its organization. So that on the whole, I think it ought to be read by people who are interested in literature much more than it should be read by people who are looking for the facts of what happened.
Bedouin ways were hard, even for those brought up to them, and for strangers terrible, a death in life. When the march, or labor, ended, I had no energy to record sensation, nor while it lasted any leisure to see the spiritual loveliness which sometimes came upon us by the way. In my notes, the cruel, rather than the beautiful, found place. We no doubt enjoyed more the rare moments of peace and forgetfulness, but I remember more the agony, the terrors, and the mistakes. They were a people of primary colors, or rather of black and white, who saw the world always in contour. They were a dogmatic people, despising doubt, our modern crown of thorns. They didn't understand our metaphysical difficulties and our introspective questionings. They knew only truth and untruth, belief and unbelief, without our hesitating retinue of finer shades. In these slow nights at Azraq, we were secure against the world. When we'd shut to the gate, all guests would assemble, and coffee and stories would go round until the last meal, and after it, till sleep came. On stormy nights, we brought in brushwood and dung, and lit a great fire in the middle of the floor. The leaping flames chased our smoke-ruffled shadows strangely about the rough stone wall behind us. Past and future flowed over us like an uneddying river. We dreamed ourselves into the spirit of the place. Sieges and feasting, raids, murders, love-singing in the night. Very painfully I drew myself again into the present and forced my mind to say that it must use this wintry weather to explore the country lying round about Deraa.
But Deraa was a Turkish garrison town. When Lawrence made his attempt at reconnaissance in November 1917, he had to go to Deraa in disguise as a Circassian Arab. It would be 24 hours before he left. His outlook on life changed forever, and it was to provide the most controversial chapter in his book and in his whole life.
We mounted the curving bank of the Palestine Railway, and from its vantage surveyed the station. Someone called out in Turkish. We walked on deftly, but a sergeant came over and took me roughly by the arm, saying, "The Bey wants you." They led me to the guard room, took away my belt, my knife, made me wash myself carefully. I passed a long day there. Soon after dark, 3 men came for me. They took me upstairs to the Bey's room. He dragged me down with him in his arms. I bore it for a little, then jerked my knee into him. He drew one of the men's bayonets, pulled up a fold of the flesh over my ribs, worked the point through after considerable trouble, and gave the blade a half-turn. The blood wavered down my side. He half-whispered to the corporal to take me out and teach me everything. The corporal came back with a whip of the Circassian sort, a thong of supple black hide. I locked my teeth to endure this thing, which lapped itself like a flaming wire about my body. A delicious warmth, probably sexual, was swelling through me. And then he flung up his arm and hacked with the full length of his whip into my groin. I next knew that I was being dragged about by two men, each disputing over a leg as though to split me apart, while a third man rode me astride.
According to his own account, Lawrence was whipped into submission, his will broken. Though he managed finally to escape, the sexual assault he describes vividly and at great length seems to have left him mentally and physically scarred for the rest of his life. He ends his account with the words, "In Deraa that night, the citadel of my integrity had been irrevocably lost."
I'm not by any means convinced that his description of what happened at Deraa, when he was supposed to have been set upon and assaulted by the Turkish commandant, is an actual word-by-word true account of what happened. But I think underneath it all, there was a substratum of truth.
I think just imagination. He imagined this. I don't know what was his motive, either to glorify himself much more, or to inflict some damage on himself by stating that he went into a lot of torment.
I think Lawrence enacted in that passage in the Seven Pillars a ritual of of exposure and being caught that was deeply necessary to his imagination. I mean, if he was carrying on all of these masquerades, these charades, these adventures, the one thing that he had to risk was being caught and found out. And I think that's really what it's about. Now, as to what exactly happened, and even whether it did happen, it's one of these questions like whether Freud's theories of seduction are based on actual experiences of seduction. I think we have to simply go with the notion that Lawrence believed it to have happened, or believed it necessary to have experienced something like that, and leave it at that.
There is no reason at all to doubt that the thing took place. One has to remember that the event actually took place in the context of the closing days of the Turkish Empire, which was a very brutal society where this kind of thing went on. There's nothing remotely surprising about it. I think that if you look at Lawrence's later statements about sex and other associated things, they are very typical of somebody who has suffered this kind of experience. And I don't think, therefore, that you could readily explain those statements if the thing hadn't taken place.
On the 9th of December 1917, Jerusalem fell to the Allies, and 2 days later, Allenby, in deference to history, made his solemn entry into the Holy City on foot. Lawrence attended the ceremony in a borrowed uniform as a member of Allenby's personal staff. It was just 3 weeks after Deraa. He was deeply moved by this historic occasion. For me, he wrote, it was the supreme moment of the war. Lawrence appears in the background of some of this newsreel footage, an unexpectedly small figure. He was 5'6" tall and unobtrusive here without his Arab clothes.
I met Lawrence in Jerusalem. I encountered Lawrence first on one of the narrow streets. He was with some Arabs. He didn't look like an Arab to me. And a little bit later, I got in touch with the British military governor of Jerusalem. I called him the successor to Pontius Pilate, Sir Ronald Storrs. And I told Storrs about this group of Arabs, and one who was a blonde wondered who he was. And Storrs opened a door to an adjoining room, and there he was. And Storrs was the one who was responsible for labeling Lawrence, because he said to me, "I want you to meet the uncrowned king of Arabia."
The journalist Lowell Thomas had been sent to the Middle East in search of a war story that might make more inspiring copy than the carnage of the Western Front. He and his cameraman visited Lawrence and Faisal in Aqaba, and the shots they took there would later become part of Thomas's adventure film. Lowell Thomas propagated the heroic legend of Lawrence of Arabia, and perhaps unwittingly encouraged the idea that Lawrence, and not Faisal, was the true leader of the Desert Campaign.
The question of Lawrence's leadership in the Arab Revolt is a very, very difficult question, because you can lead on many levels. As far as the British were concerned, Lawrence was a liaison officer with the Arab forces, and his responsibility was to see that the Arab forces did what the British C&C wanted done. Now, insofar as that happened, which on the whole it did happen, you have to say that one way or another, Lawrence persuaded, directly, indirectly, subtly, unsubtly, he persuaded these people to go the way that Allenby wanted them to go. Now, that's one side of the picture. The other side of the picture is that, of course, in a general sense, these people wanted to go there anyway.
اي والله له دور والله له دور طيب واللي يقول لك دور ورنس ما هو طيب ما هو صادق إلا يقضب الخواطر والله ورنس الرجل اشتغل والفضل للأشراف والفضل الكبير للأشراف.
The Imperial Camel Corps joined the Desert Campaign in its later stages. They operated separately from the Arab force, but Lawrence participated in the planning and support of some of their exploits. It was a chance for regular soldiers to witness this remarkable and now famous amateur in action.
A lot of the Lawrence legend, you know, has been exaggerated terrifically. And most of his detractors and critics have been people who never saw him, and certainly never worked with him, and fought with him, and rode with him, and ate with him, and slept with him, as I did for several weeks on end. We knew Lawrence already by repute, of course. His fame had preceded him. We'd been out there long enough to have heard of a British officer doing remarkable things with the Arabs away to our right. One day, the lookout reported a group of Arabs, probably 6 or 8 of them, camel-mounted, of course, approaching from the southeast, from the approximate direction of Aqaba. So I went forward to interrogate them. And as I approached, I quickly realized that this wasn't necessary at all, because their leader was an obvious European. No attempt at disguise beyond the fact that he was dressed completely in Arab costume. And true enough, he introduced himself as Captain Lawrence. But as we got to know him better, of course, the whole of the Camel Corps, or at least the whole of those of us who served with him, absolutely worshipped him. Lawrence, of course, was not militaristic in the ordinary sense. I think this is what endeared him to us. No staff college training. He was just a natural guerrilla leader with a thorough knowledge of the country, its people, its languages, its customs. It impressed us from the start, because Lawrence was the first officer we'd ever had, the first commander we'd ever had, who took his troops entirely into his confidence. And remember, these were the days of "there's not to reason why." And later on, of course, he personally reconnoitered every one of our objectives before we were committed to the attack.
One of the objectives, to be hit by night, was the railway station of Mudawara on the Hejaz line south of Aqaba. It was defended by a substantial Turkish garrison.
Our attack was at 4 o'clock in the morning in complete darkness, as advised by Lawrence, and it was a great success. The Turks were taken completely by surprise. They hadn't any idea there were any Pukka British troops within 100 miles. We even caught some of the Turkish officers were still in the bell tents in their pajamas. But when daylight came, we'd got the whole position except the northern redoubt, which was rather too strongly held for our small raiding party to take. But Lawrence had provided for this, and at first light along came two planes of the Hedjaz flight, and after a couple of 100-pound bombs from each at very low altitude, of course, the Turks came streaming out, waving any dirty old rag which looked like a white flag. Our prisoners, of course, almost outnumbered ourselves, so they were to be taken back by the Arabs to Aqaba at the rate of 1 golden sovereign per prisoner. But Lawrence knew perfectly well, if we paid them the whole fee before they went, the Arabs would take them behind the nearest hill and shoot the lot. So they were paid at the rate of half a sovereign per head on dispatch, with a chitty to the British commander in Aqaba to pay the remaining 10 bob and half, as we called it, when they got there. And point of fact, everyone arrived intact.
But some regular officers, though they admired him, found Lawrence's style a shade flamboyant.
I didn't approve of Lawrence's methods of blowing things up. He wasn't trained as a sapper, and he liked to make as big a bang as possible. He wasted a great deal of the explosives that had been brought to great trouble on camelback for hundreds of miles. And on this occasion, he put everything he could lay his hand on under the bridge. Knowing his habits, I said, "Now, please, sir, give me a little warning before you fire your charges. Let me get my men away." He said, "Oh, yes, all right, don't fuss, don't fuss." So we went down, and I was quite happily putting my charges in, and suddenly there was a most terrific bang, and the bridge flew into the air and fell all over the station. I was absolutely furious, as furious as a subaltern could be with a colonel, which had its limits. And he sat on a boulder and laughed at me.
For a year and a half I had been in motion, riding 1,000 miles each month upon camels, with added nervous hours in crazy aeroplanes, or rushing across country in powerful cars. In my last 5 actions I had been hit, and my body so dreaded further pain that now I had to force myself under fire. Generally I had been hungry, lately always cold, and frost and dirt had poisoned my hurts into a festering mass of sores. My will had gone, and I feared to be alone, lest the winds of circumstance, or power, or lust, blow my empty soul away.
The Arabs moved on northwards towards their goal, Damascus. Lawrence, riding with them, was still obsessed with the deceit being perpetrated by the Allies and by him.
The cabinet raised the Arabs to fight for us by definite promises of self-government. It was evident from the beginning that if we won the war, these promises would be dead paper. I presumed, seeing no other leader with the will and power, that I would survive the campaigns and be able to defeat not merely the Turks on the battlefield, but my own country and its allies in the council chamber. I risked the fraud on my conviction that better we win and break our word than lose.
He was very keen that the Arabs get to Damascus first because he wanted them to have a claim. He was with them that entering Damascus was important. And if they enter Damascus first, they will have a good claim in the peace discussions afterwards.
Lawrence, with units of the Arab and Allied armies, finally entered Damascus on October the 1st, 1918. The collapse of Turkish rule in the city had been so complete that no one was left to make a formal surrender. The Turkish leaders had already fled, and the Arab inhabitants had been able to proclaim their own administration before the Allies entered the city.
Damascus went mad with joy. Every man, woman, and child in this city seemed in the streets. The men tossed up their tarbushes to cheer. The women tore off their veils. Householders threw flowers, hangings, carpets into the road before us. Poor dervishes made themselves our running footmen in front and behind, howling and cutting themselves with frenzy. And over the local cries came the measured roar of men's voices, chanting Faisal, Nasir, Shukri, Lawrence.
As the British and Arab forces met, so for the first time did their leaders, Allenby and Faisal, at the Hotel Victoria. Faisal left the meeting a disappointed man, for Allenby had had the task of telling him what Lawrence had agonized over for so long, that the Arabs were not to have the independence they'd been promised, that having at last reached Damascus, they were not to take sole possession. The whole of Syria would become a French protectorate. Allenby left the hotel shortly after Faisal. Still inside was a depressed and sickened T.E. Lawrence, who'd had the unenviable job of interpreter while Faisal was given the news. He now sensed, as he later put it in 7 Pillars, that his springs of action were exhausted, that the time had come for him to quit the stage.
Being half poet, I don't value material things much. Sensation and mind seem to me much greater. And the idea, such a thing as the impulse that took us into Damascus, the only thing worth doing. The whole countryside was on fire with enthusiasm, and in the town 100,000 people shouted my name. From this cup I drank as deeply as any man should do, and was sated with it. When Faisal had gone, I made to Allenby the last, and also, I think, the first request I ever made for myself, leave to go away. In the end, he agreed. And then at once I knew how much I was sorry.
He was back in Oxford when the war ended on November the 11th, 1918. 2 brothers and many more young men of his generation had died on the battlefields. And the cause for which Lawrence himself had fought in the desert could scarcely have seemed more remote. For Britain, it was the peace in Europe that really counted. Lawrence was physically and emotionally drained, his weight down to around 7 stone. This portrait was made during his last days in Damascus. In England, he turned at once to the next task in hand. He submitted to the British cabinet his comprehensive proposals for the solution of what was still the Arabian question.
I think his notion was that the ideal outcome of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire would be an independent Arab kingdom in very close relationship with the British Empire. He believed that, certainly, that for a generation or so, this new Arab kingdom would need a great deal of help, financial, technical, political, everything else you like, to stand on its feet, and that this would best come from the British Empire.
But as Lawrence had feared, when the victorious powers assembled for the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, they reverted to their secret agreements and prepared to carve up the Middle East, giving the Arabs some show of independence, but leaving the real power still in the hands of Britain and France. Faisal was there at Versailles to represent the Arabs, with Lawrence as his leading European advocate. But without Lawrence's intervention, Faisal wouldn't even have had a seat at the conference table. Lawrence himself is said to have cut quite a dash in Paris, impressing key figures like Clemenceau and Lloyd George, but to little effect. Faisal left Versailles empty-handed and aggrieved. In London's Covent Garden in the same year, the Middle East War became the subject of an illustrated lecture which drew enthusiastic crowds to the Opera House. The presenter was that same Lowell Thomas who'd filmed Lawrence in the desert. Allenby had top billing, but Thomas's presentation gradually changed to turn the popular figure of Lawrence into the real star. From now onwards, he would be known as Lawrence of Arabia.
Well, I think he just had to put up with it. He'd put up with it in the first place with Lowell Thomas, who was lecturing about him in London, because it helped the Arab cause at the peace conference. Or he thought it would. It actually failed to do anything because the peace conference was dominated by the French.
Tell me a bit about the Lowell Thomas lectures.
Well, Lowell Thomas was a very nice chap, and you really couldn't be nasty to him. He meant extremely well.
What did Lawrence T.E. think about the lectures?
He thought they were funny. They were.
They helped to create the kind of myth about...
Yes, that was the start of the myth. After that, it went on increasing.
While the adulation grew, Lawrence himself was ensconced at All Souls, Oxford, where he'd been offered a fellowship. The income from this and the sanctuary of an Oxford college meant he could escape from the public eye and start to write the ambitious book he'd been planning during his years in the desert.
I've had one craving all my life, for the power of self-expression in some imaginative form. At last, accident, with perverted humour in casting me as a man of action, had given me a place in the Arab Revolt, a theme ready and epic to a direct eye and hand, thus offering me an outlet in literature.
At Oxford, he struck up a friendship with an aspiring young poet called Robert Graves, giving him both encouragement and financial help. Graves was to write Lawrence's first biography. And through him, Lawrence got to know other writers. Siegfried Sassoon, one of the great poets and novelists of the First World War.
He seemed to me to be a man who had power over life. I couldn't exactly say what I meant by it, but I'd say that he was a man who could make things happen through his influence on other people.
John Buchan, too, was impressed. He wrote, "I'm not much of a hero worshipper, but I could have followed Lawrence over the edge of the world." The painter Augustus John made many portraits of Lawrence, and they became close friends. Relationships like these, unrelated to the war, became profoundly important for him.
I think most of his friends felt protective towards him, his friends of 1920 onwards, because he was, in fact, in ruins after enormous overexertion over all those years. 2 or 3 years in the Arabian campaign, followed by all the peace conference fuss.
He had begun his book in Paris and continued it at All Souls, but the place he found most conducive to writing was the attic room of an office in Barton Street, Westminster, lent him by an architect friend. The greater part of a first draft was mislaid or stolen at Reading Station. It seemed like a release. "I've lost the damn thing," he told Hogarth. But Hogarth and others urged him to try again, so the book was painfully rebuilt from memory and from his surviving notes. He wrote later that the sense of the country and atmosphere and climate and furniture of Arabia hung tightly around me as I worked. Denying himself food and sleep, at times all but delirious, he slogged on through the winter of 1919, sometimes producing up to 5,000 words a day. At the end of it,
when the book was finished and I read it, the fact that it wasn't a work of art rose up and hit me in the face, and I hated it.
He sent the manuscript to George Bernard Shaw, asking for his professional advice.
I'd like you to read it, partly because you are you, partly because I may profit by your reading it. You see, the war was, for us who were in it, an overwrought time in which we lost our normal footing. I wrote this thing in the war atmosphere and believe that it is stinking with it. Also, there is a good deal of cruelty and some excitement. All these things in a beginner's hands tend to force him over the edge, and I suspect there is much overwriting.
But Shaw gave him encouragement and advice. His other friends supported him, and he regained his confidence. Now he began to plan the book on a grand scale, finely printed and with splendid illustrations by Eric Kennington. This first edition was for subscribers only. 7 Pillars turned out to be more than a memoir of his own exploits in the desert campaign. It became an intimate portrait of a whole people, a people he'd once dreamed might become one Arab nation.
The least morbid of peoples, they had accepted the gift of life unquestioningly, as axiomatic. An unintelligible, passionate yearning drove them out into the desert. Their mind was strange and dark, full of depressions and exaltations, lacking in rule, but with more of ardor and more fertile in belief than any other in the world. They were as unstable as water, and like water would perhaps finally prevail.
you see, Lawrence's Arabs, or at least the Arabs he talks about in the Seven Pillars, are really Lawrence's Arabs. I mean, I would hate to see Lawrence used, as Henry Kissinger has used him, to explain the Semitic or Arab mind. I don't think you can talk about the Arabs the way Lawrence did. I mean, there are many different kinds of Arabs. And Lawrence had a great weakness, I think, and that was to leap to all kinds of fancy generalizations. Now, if you take them as poetic generalizations, they're fine, but if, as Lawrence intended them often to be, you look at them as sort of political generalizations about people that you have to deal with, I think they're very dangerous. I think Lawrence was a racist. I mean, I think he really felt that the Arabs were all one thing, that they represented something fundamentally interesting, but sort of inferior to a white Englishman, which is what he was. So, I don't hold that specially against him. I mean, most of his contemporaries felt the way he did.
I'm quite sure he wasn't a racist. I don't think he could have achieved what he did, living among a very proud and disciplined people, and ever given the impression that he looked down on them, and I don't think he could have survived among Bedouin tribesmen and men of great dignity and scholarship, such as Sharif Hussein, the Grand Sharif of Mecca, Abdullah, Emir Abdullah, Emir Faisal. I think if Faisal had thought that Lawrence was patronizing him, he'd have thrown him out of the camp.
I was sent to these Arabs as a stranger, unable to think their thoughts or subscribe their beliefs, but charged by duty to lead them forward and to develop to the highest any movement of theirs profitable to England in her war. If I could not assume their character, I could at least conceal my own and pass among them without evident friction and unnoticed influence. A man who gives himself to be a possession of aliens leads a Yahoo life, having bartered his soul to a brute-master. He is not of them. He may persuade himself of a mission, batter and twist them into something which they, of their own accord, would not have been. He may imitate them so well that they spuriously imitate him back again. Then he is giving away his own environment, pretending to theirs, and pretenses are hollow, worthless things.
Lawrence attended yet another peace conference at Cairo in 1921. He went as advisor to Churchill, then colonial secretary. There a new settlement was worked out, which gave some measure of sovereignty to the Arabs.
I think Churchill regarded him as his principal advisor, and I have no doubt that a great deal of what came out of that conference, whether it was for good or for bad, was due to Lawrence's influence on Churchill. It could be right to say that he made some awful blunders. The settlement, as he called it, ended up, I think, by saying that now he could rest on his laurels, and the Arabs had got what they ought to have had. Well, of course they hadn't. They'd got a British mandate in Palestine, a British mandate in Iraq, a British mandate in Transjordan, and a French mandate in Syria and Lebanon. Well, it wasn't what they went to war for.
This idea that you should create little states, each of which represents a particular clan or religion or interest, has, I think, done more harm than good. And I think much of the unrest in the region since World War II is a direct reflection of that. That is to say, I think that the states that Lawrence and others created out of the large undifferentiated mass of the Southern Ottoman Empire have really failed. I mean, all of these states are really map creations. And if you look at Lebanon today, if you look at what's happening in Palestine, Israel, the problems of Syria, the problems of Jordan, you're really seeing the results of a vision of the world more or less crumbling.
I must put on record my conviction that England is out of the Arab affair with clean hands. I was happy to withdraw from a political milieu which had never been congenial.
Withdraw was something of an understatement. This next photograph of Lawrence of Arabia, war hero, diplomat and scholar, shows him in 1922 as ordinary aircraftsman John Hume Ross.
I have done with politics, I have done with the Orient, and I have done with intellectuality. Oh, Lord, I am so tired. I want so much to lie down and sleep and die. Die is best, because there's no Valley.
He'd changed his name, reduced himself to the ranks, and joined the RAF. He was determined to shake off the nightmare that Lawrence of Arabia had become. At first, the disguise seemed perfect. Certainly his hut orderly, Jock Chambers, had no idea who he was.
I felt somehow that I ought to be tough with him. I don't know why. And I said, now, don't forget I'm hut orderly here. And when you scrub that bed, short arse, you see you do it properly, no tide marks. He said, oh, all right. And he scrubbed it twice before I was satisfied.
But the anonymity of the ranks didn't fool Fleet Street for long.
I was on guard with him when the Daily Express man came along, and the Times man. In fact, it was the Times man who said to Lawrence, who was actually standing on guard. He said, can I go in and see this bloke Lawrence? So Lawrence said, no, I'm here to stop you. And he just casually said to him, you don't happen to be in, do you? And he said, no, do I look like a soldier? That was all to it. This bloke walked away.
I've now been sacked from the RAF as a person with altogether too large a publicity factor for the ranks.
But the ranks was where he wanted to be. In desperation, he changed his name again to Thomas Edward Shaw and enlisted as a private in the army. He was posted to the Tank Corps at Bovington Camp in Dorset.
I didn't know who he was, but I was parked almost opposite him in the hut. After a day or two, I found out who he was and why he was in the army. He told me he transferred from the Air Force. And he said, you probably wonder why the name Shaw, when it was Ross in the Air Force. They asked me what name I wanted to go under. I opened a telephone book, jabbed my finger on it, said that one, and it happened to be Shaw. So there was no connection with GBS. It just happened.
Here every man has joined because he was down and out. We're all here unavoidably, in a last resort, and we assume this world's failures in one another. We are social bedrock, and each of us values the rest as cheap as he knows himself to be. We're all guilty alike, you know. You wouldn't exist, I wouldn't exist without this carnality. Everything with flesh in its mixture is the achievement of a moment when the lusty thought of Hut 12 has passed to action conceived. And isn't it true that the fault of birth rests somewhat on the child? I believe it's we who led our parents on to bear us, and it's our unborn children who make our flesh itch. A filthy business, all of it.
He did explain to me, almost in detail, why, with the Arab revolt, he'd been told to promise certain things to the Arabs. And he felt so let down with making these promises. He didn't want to make any decisions or promises on behalf of the government or anyone. He didn't want any authority at all. So it came down to the lowest possible wrong. That was his explanation. I admired him for it, because I realised he could have really gone to great places, but he was so disillusioned.
I consumed the day and myself brooding, galloping mentally down 20 divergent roads at once, as apart and alone as in Barton Street in my attic. When my mood gets too hot and I find myself wandering beyond control, I pull out my motorbike and hurl it top speed through these unfit roads for hour after hour. My nerves are jaded and gone near dead, so that nothing less than hours of voluntary danger will prick them into life, and the life they reach then is a melancholy joy at risking something worth exactly 2 9pence a day.
I suppose in a way he was a loner and I was a loner. We gravitated. Could be that, or we just got on easily with each other. But we didn't mix with any of the others. Well, there was an odd one occasionally, but we were together most of the time. And then eventually took on that cottage.
The cottage is alone in a dip in the moor. Very quiet, very lonely, very bare. a mile from camp, furnished with a bed, a bicycle, 3 chairs, 100 books, a gramophone and a table. Many windows, oak trees, rhododendron, laurels, heather, Dorsetshire to look at. I don't sleep here, but come out 4:30 p.m. till 9 p.m. nearly every evening and dream or write or read by the fire.
We had all the good music. Not the sort of chamber music that I can't stick, but it was all good. He knew music. We used to go to the proms at times to listen.
Dear Sir Edward, this is from my cottage, and we've just been playing your second symphony. 3 of us, a sailor, a tank corps soldier, and myself. We agreed that you must be written to, and told that this symphony gets further under our skins than anything else in the record library of Clouds Hill. We have the violin concerto too, so that says quite a lot. Generally, we play the symphony last of all, towards the middle of the night, because nothing comes off very well after it. One seems to stop there.
In Dorset, he continued to develop close friendships with Thomas Hardy, who was a near neighbour, with Lady Astor, the politician and socialite, and with another distinguished novelist who was a frequent guest at Clouds Hill, E.M. Forster.
I liked the place at once. His friends were friendly to me. I felt easy. And to feel easy was, in T.E.'s eyes, a great recommendation. We weren't to care as soon as we were inside the place. We were to feel easy. We weren't to worry about the world and the standards which the world imposes. And here we talked and played Beethoven's symphonies to one another from the gramophone and ate and drank. We drank water only, or tea. No alcohol ever entered Clouds Hill, and we ate, this sounds less romantic, we ate out of tins. T.E. always laid in a stock of tinned dainties for his guests. There were no fixed hours for meals, no tablecloth, and no one sat down. If you felt hungry, you opened the tin and drifted about with it.
Shortly after we joined, he was a keen swimmer and I was as well. We went down to Arishmel as a tiny little bay by Longworth Cove across the ranges. And we stripped off for swimming, and I looked at his back and it was covered with scars. I said, "You look as if you've been beaten up." There was a pause and he said, "Well, I have, I'll tell you about it later." After swimming, we were just sitting there talking. And he told me about when he was captured by the Turks and they whipped him. And then he showed me a scar on his tummy where they'd held the skin out and pushed a bayonet through and twisted it. He said, "Oh, I've told you, but I'll tell you more in detail some other time." A lot of people say he wasn't beaten up, but I saw the scars. They were bad.
The Deraa experience of 1917 had left more than physical wounds. He wrote movingly about it in the course of a long and intense correspondence with Bernard Shaw's wife, Charlotte.
About that night. I shouldn't tell you because decent men don't talk about such things. I wanted to put it plain in the book and wrestle for days with my self-respect. For fear of being hurt, or rather to earn 5 minutes respite from a pain which drove me mad, I gave away the only possession we are born into life with, our bodily integrity. It's an unforgivable matter, an irrevocable position. And it's that which has made me forswear decent living and the exercise of my not contemptible wits and talents.
In 1969, the Sunday Times revealed that Lawrence was also beaten in later life. Their articles were based on the account of an ex-tank corps soldier, now dead, who claimed to have, at Lawrence's request, submitted him to a number of rigorous birchings over a period of some years.
He hated the thought of sex. he had read any amount of medieval literature about characters of us, some of them saints, some of them not, some ordinary people, who had quelled sexual longings by beating. And that's what he did.
He was beaten.
Yes.
Did you know about this at the time?
No, I knew about it immediately after his death. But of course said nothing. It's not a thing people can understand easily.
Sometimes I wonder how far mad I am, and if a madhouse will not be my next and merciful stage. Merciful compared with this place, which hurts me body and soul. It's terrible to hold myself voluntarily here, and yet I want to stay here till it no longer hurts me, till the burnt child no longer feels the fire. Do you think there have been many lay monks of my persuasion?
Lawrence detested the army and campaigned hard to be readmitted into the RAF. Finally, after going so far as virtually to threaten suicide, he was allowed back. The 10 years that followed brought him a remarkable contentment. But when the RAF posted him to India in 1926, the rumors began to grow that he was there for some diplomatic purpose, perhaps even a cloak and dagger operation. Both the press and the public continued to see him as a buccanesque adventurer resolving exotic problems in far places on behalf of the empire. In fact, he was, in his own words, doing a perambulating clerkly job. He worked in the engine repair depot at Karachi. He'd always had a natural aptitude for mechanics, and in his spare time he was engaged in nothing more sinister than the translation of Homer's Odyssey. But back home, the newspaper stories multiplied, and when there was a rebellion in Afghanistan in 1928, one paper trumped up a story that Lawrence was behind it. Again, his presence had become an embarrassment, and he was rushed back to England. It was this arrival by sea that was so effectively ambushed by the press and the newsreels.
I'm being hunted and don't like it. When the cry dies down, I'll come out of my hole and see people.
These home movies are from the late 20s. Here he's with the American publisher, F.N. Doubleday. They'd met in Paris, and Doubleday wrote that Lawrence was one of the most brilliant conversationalists he ever met. They became firm friends. And these shots of Lawrence in a speedboat, not just rest and recreation. As a designer and mechanic, he played a vital role in developing high-speed launches for use in air-sea rescue work. He involved himself in this after seeing the 9-man crew of a flying boat drown when the plane crashed into the sea. There were those, like Churchill, who hoped he might continue to serve the nation, as Churchill said, in these troubled times. But Lawrence himself now had no such plans.
It is my firm impression that T.E. had aged perceptibly. He was, in fact, quite near the end of his life, because he'd had too much to do in it. He'd endured things which would have killed most people, and they had, I think, half killed him.
On the 26th of February 1935, he retired reluctantly from the RAF. This photograph was taken at Bridlington on his last day.
My losing the RAF numbs me, so that I haven't much feeling to spare for a while. In fact, I find myself wishing all the time that my own curtain would fall.
He sought what he called quietude at Clouds Hill, but the press pursued him as ever, even throwing stones at his roof to bring him out. The quietude, he wrote, has been a complete failure. He found some relief, as ever, in speed. He had relicensed his motorcycle. But his letters to friends show him increasingly uneasy and confused. This from May the 5th, 1935.
I'm rather puzzled to find out what has happened to me, is happening, and will happen. At present, the feeling is mere bewilderment. I imagine leaves must feel like this after they've fallen from the tree.
On the 13th of May, he rode down from Clouds Hill to Bovington Camp, a mile away, to send a telegram. On the way back, he swerved to avoid two errand boys on bicycles. He crashed and suffered extensive head injuries. After 6 days in a coma, he died. He was 46. Some of the newspapers made a sensation even of his death. There were hints of sinister plots and conspiracies. But there was profound shock, too, and a sense of loss. To his funeral came many of the great and famous, and some of the men he'd fought alongside in the desert. Hundreds of others came from all over Britain, close friends, as well as admirers who'd never actually met him. Churchill said of him, "His name will live in history. It will live in English letters. It will live in the annals of war. It will live in the traditions of the Royal Air Force and in the legends of Arabia."
He seems to answer some requirement. It's almost religious. In fact, it is a religion. I had great difficulty in not allowing myself to be used as a St. Paul of it. I had, I should think, something like 500 letters soon after his death. The majority wanted me to take up his mantle. I suppose it was partly his disdain for worldly success. He had wanted it when he was young. He got it and despised it.
Later, when we were often riding inland, my mind used to turn me from the direct road to clear my senses by a night in run, and by the ride down its dawnlit valley towards the shining plains, or up its valley in the sunset towards that glowing square which my timid anticipation never let me reach. I would say, shall I ride on this time, beyond the Kazeil, and know it all?